This is I call this the definition of a stress case in the most empathetic way. The person in the grip of old distress says things that are not pertinent, does things that don't work, fails to cope with the situation at hand, and endures terrible feelings that have nothing to do with the present. How many of you know this person? You all know someone like this. You
That's my two
possibly.
daughters right now. No, just kidding.
And okay, so this was before 2020 happened. I used this in my mental health keynote and some of the other things that I did. I see someone's put in the chat, so I'll look at that in just a second. This has to do with trauma, which we won't get into too much today, but what I want you to understand when it comes to mental health and the question, is it an illness or an injury? So many of us have an old trauma or an old injury stuck in that old part of our brain, the amygdala. And when something happens when we're young or something severe happens when we're older, if we don't have a very specific resource and ability to process that event that happened in a very specific window of time, what happens is our nervous system and our brain tuck that memory away back here. It gets stuck there to protect us so that when something similar happens, we are ready to defend ourselves from it. I promise you, in your companies, you are paying for this right now. This is one of the things that costs companies the most money when it comes to mental health, when it comes to prescription medications, because what happens is when we have an old trauma stuck in our brains, and I know this is a lot for all you in the safety and, you know, kind of figuring all this stuff out, but this is what is at play right now. For a lot of people, the pandemic re-triggered old things. So what happens in our brains and in our bodies when something that happens in the present day reminds us of something that was likely more severe, we encounter the same stress response, the same cascade of neurotransmitters and hormones in our physiology that we did back then in response to what's happening now. And usually that's an overblown response. So that is why in the mental health conversation, it's a really, really important question, because that is so much of what you are experiencing in your rising prescription costs and in your stress leaves. And the pandemic has triggered this like you just wouldn't believe in people, which is where the great resignation and the great discontent and whatever they're all calling it. I don't know what it's like in your particular industry. But this is kind of the bad news, which is also more of a you're welcome news, is that once a company and a leadership team understands some of these things that are actually operating underneath this, you learn a different way to navigate the issues that you're dealing with. You learn a different way to inform your wellness program. You don't have to ditch your whole wellness program if you have one, but there are ways that you can inform it and incorporate a strategy to actually be more effective. Because this timeline of this person and all the stuff that we've talked about, what's next are high blood pressure medications. And people are, and then you move into metabolic syndrome if the food, the microbiome, the nervous system, and those kinds of things aren't addressed. People are working for you longer than they ever did before because no one can afford to retire anymore. So now you're also paying for an extra 5 to 10 years of these costs. So an intervention in a wellness strategy is literally the new prevention, because there is no preventing this stuff. It's already happened, but the intervention can really change the trajectory of those things.